Hi, this is Victor Morganti from Vive. You're looking at the Boston Conceptual Modeling tool. Today we'll be looking at entity types in object role modeling and reference schemes and reference modes for entity types. If we drag a entity type onto this page within a model and give that entity type a name, which we're going to call person, we've created an entity type within our schema person. Now notice that this particular entity type is coloured red, which indicates that there's an error in the model or the schema. And if we right click on the entity type, we'll see the model errors and where the error is that the entity type requires a reference scheme, so it hasn't got a reference scheme. So what is a reference scheme for an entity type, and what is a reference mode for an entity type, and why do we need them? I find the easiest way to describe that is to have a look at what object role modeling is all about and to look at what the downstream implications of not having a reference scheme for an entity type are. I find the easiest way to answer the question is to have a look at a corresponding entity relationship diagram for a page, and if we open an existing entity relationship diagram within the same model and go to the model dictionary, sure enough we've got an entity person within our model dictionary, but if we try and drag that onto the page, it's not going to allow us to do that. And the reason is because that entity currently has no attributes. And if we follow the downstream implications of that, if we were to convert our entity relationship diagram to a relational model within a relational database, that entity would correspond to a table without any columns. So an entity within an entity relationship diagram without any attributes would be a table within an a relational database without any columns. And you just can't do that, and you can't work with it. So correspondingly, if we convert this page to a property graph schema and give that a second to finish and open the property graph schema, there's absolutely no nodes within our property graph schema, even though we've got a node within our model dictionary, which we can't drag onto the page because there's no way of uniquely identifying elements or entities of that particular node type within our property graph schema or our graph database. So let's go back to the object role model and right click on the person entity type, go to properties, and we're going to give that entity type a reference mode, which we're going to set to ID. So we have a unique way of identifying entities of that entity type. So person has a reference mode of ID. So we call that a simple reference scheme for that entity type. So it's a simple reference scheme which provides the way of uniquely identifying entities or persons within the person entity type. Now if we go back to our entity relationship diagram and go to the model dictionary, we can see that our entity now has one attribute, which is person ID, and we can drag that onto our entity relationship diagram. So person has a person ID, which we'll notice is also forming the primary key of the entity and is mandatory. Similarly, if we go to the property graph schema, we can drag the person node onto our property graph schema, and if we control and left click on the node, we'll see person ID as a property of the node. So that's how we uniquely identify a person or an entity of that node type, or a entity of the entity person within an entity relationship diagram, or a person of the entity type in object role modeling. Now that's one way of uniquely identifying an entity type within object role modeling. We might also want to do something like this. So if we go to the virtual analyst and say person has one first name, create a value type for name and create that fact type. And we're going to do this the same for last name. Just change first to last here. And we're going to create that fact type. If we wanted to uniquely identify people within the person entity type by their first name and last name, the way we would do that is by creating a compound reference scheme for that entity type. So let's go back to the toolbox and grab an external uniqueness constraint and drop that on our page and set that up for first name and last name. Now, to make that the primary reference scheme, we go to Properties, click on the external uniqueness constraint and set the isPreferred identifier to true. And now that is the unique identifier for the person entity type. So person, first name and last name uniquely identifies person. We've kept our unique identifier for person being person ID as a particular unique identifier for person, but it's not the primary way we're going to do that. So if we go back to our entity relationship diagram, we'll now see that first name and last name is the primary key for the person entity. Now, if I display the index information for the person entity, we can see that the PK, the primary key, is first name and last name, but we still have a uniqueness constraint on person ID. So we can still uniquely identify a person by their person ID, but we've said that the primary key is first name and last name, which corresponds to our preferred reference scheme in our object role model. So there's a one-to-one relationship between person and person ID, so that's still a unique identifier, but the primary reference scheme is first name and last name, and we call that a compound reference scheme. If we go over to property graph schema, we can't really see that information on here. We can see that we've created the properties, first name and last name, against that node, but we can't see that it's the primary reference scheme or the primary key for the entity or the entity type in the object role model. So thank you very much for watching. That's reference schemes and reference modes in object role modeling and how they relate to entity relationship diagrams and property graph schemas, and ultimately how they manifest themselves within databases when you create a database. Thanks for watching. Please hit the likes and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.